can't see anyone.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Lees, and Director of Engagement from Lawyer Checker. Welcome to our joint enterprise this morning between CTS and Lawyer Checker. CTS being legal IT experts and Lawyer Checker being fraud and cyber experts in the legal sector. We're going to be discussing how law firms can protect themselves and understand how to prevent threats. We're going to look at how law firms can minimize the damage to their reputation and their balance sheet. And we're also going to talk about how law firms can remain compliant and avoid regulator fines following an attack. I'm joined this morning by David Fazakali, in-house legal CIO at CTS. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
And I'm also joined by Stephen Gehring. Stephen is a principal consultant with APS Integration Limited and has expertise around cybersecurity and data protection, as well as being a sort of transformation consultant. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Tom. Good morning, everybody.
Well, we seem to have a technical problem with Stephen. I can't seem to hear him. We'll come back to Stephen in a moment. And lastly, we have Jen Williams. Jen is the head of IT at Lawyer Checker. Good morning, Jen.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, our audience seems to be able to hear us okay. Our audience seems to be able to hear us okay, but we can't, as presenters, hear or see each other, which is a little bit baffling. But we'll work through that. David, if you could start us off, what is the scale of threat to law firms and what is the impact on those firms that fall victim to cybercrime?
Thanks, Tom. A few thoughts from me on this. The threat is constant. It's ever more sophisticated and becoming more sophisticated, and the threat actors, as we call them, the cyber criminals, are as opportunistic as ever. And I have some thoughts that actually since home working and lockdowns, they've become more opportunistic, trying to capitalize on what is the weak point, which is normally the human being in the process. And people at home, I think, have become more of a target through this period of time. I think impersonation remains high, certainly in those law firms that are quite transactional, conveyancing firms, especially where money transactions go on. I think fee earners being impersonated by the criminals to the end client is something that has been constant and continuous, and that continues to be a regular threat area. Phishing attacks are becoming more specific, more targeted rather than more generalized. And again, focusing on the human being in that process. I think social media scraping of people's personal details for profiling them and targeting phishing campaigns is something that we've seen increase. And of course, the phishing attacks use very real scenarios to try and target people. I think an obvious example of that is we all got used to using Amazon all daily, almost, for some of us, for our shops and various bits and pieces. And so we're all expecting Amazon deliveries at home. And so when we receive phishing attacks, which we don't know phishing attacks, your Amazon parcel X, Y, and Z, click here. there's more of an opportunity to trick people into feeling as though they're responding to something genuine. So phishing attacks is something I think is something that's been on the rise through this period. Targeted threats to individuals. I know in the last firm I worked for, certain people were targeted by criminals saying, we have indecent images of your daughter, and if you don't respond by paying a ransom or giving us money or doing what we want, we will flood the internet with these images. The majority of the time, of course, these are complete lies, but that type of intimidation I didn't see a few years ago, but in the last 24 months, I've seen more of that going on as well. As I said before, I think what remains high is that the human weak point, and people working from home, perhaps away from training facilities where we can sort of coach and guide people and monitor them maybe a little bit easier in the office. It's a bit more difficult at the home. Now, the impact to legal. So, those threats and others exist and are increasing. But the impact to legal, I think, breaks down to a few different ways. Reputational harm, if you've had a cyber incident of some form, depending on the size of it. And why is your reputation harmed? Well, certainly if it's your clients can be feel not so good about you if you've had an incident, so it can harm your reputation with clients. Your banks and your lenders and people who maybe support the law firm in some way can take issue if they don't think you're investing enough in your IT cybersecurity, and partners that you deal with as well. So there are a lot of reputational issues. Data loss itself is if the impact of what has happened is data loss or data theft, then that increases the reputational issue up around your own sensitive IP. But I think for most of us, client data, client information, if that is lost, that is very, very harmful indeed to the client and perhaps to the law firm. There are financial costs as well, of course. Your trading, if you lose trading time and your downtime, then that has a financial impact. The cost of the recovery of whatever it is that you've had to go through, costs and potential fines. And I know Stefan will talk a little bit more about that in a second, along with now the GDPR Act. And Stefan, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think from 2018, things changed. You couldn't just deal with this privately anymore and hope to maybe just deal with it in a non-public way. You now have regulatory responsibilities to report these matters. And that is new. And before handing over, I think the one that maybe isn't talked about enough is the welfare of people and how cyber crime affects them. And I'll come on to this a little bit later in one of the questions about some real personal examples. But dealing with a cyber event, especially if it's a significant one, is a stressful thing. And then the consequences after the event with regards to people's wellness and well-being and welfare and how they have coped or how they then not cope post the event is something that I think has an impact on people, which I will go into a little bit more later on.
Thank you very much, David. That's a very good prompt for me to jump straight into that and particularly look at it from a cost angle. I'll be talking about loss, and loss actually in almost every single case means loss of revenue, loss of reputation. So my last major event that I took part was while I was working for an investment goods supplier. They supplied to the UK Department for Transport. Rather expensive goods, each throw about 80 million in cost, and therefore obviously also very high penalties for late delivery. And we had just trimmed our programs to such a point that we could deliver on deadlines, so wouldn't have incurred any cost. And at that point, a ransom attack hit very widely throughout the UK. The NHS was very badly affected at the time as well. So effectively, most of us in the corporate world who were affected had no IT supply to begin with, because effectively all servers needed to be shut down. A lot of them needed to be checked. A lot of them needed to be rebuilt as well. We managed to return to full operations within 24 hours. And through doing so, we managed to avoid a major penalty because we lost only one day. we very soon heard afterwards that other suppliers were affected much worse, and it took them up to 3 days to get back to full operation. And of course, it was then more widely known. And this was literally just 1 year before the introduction of GDPR, and later on the DPA 2018. And David quite rightly referred to the fact that at that particular point, we would have had to make it public that we were affected, because we would have had to inform our clients that this event took place. So GDPR does put very much more a public face onto it, and of course the report has to be done within 72 hours, and it has to be comprehensively investigated. But talking about loss, that was one example where we managed to just skid past the worst damage. Others didn't do so well out of that, and I know that a number of companies really struggled for several years to recover from that. And as David said, loss of data, particularly if you're working with clients who are absolutely dependent on their data, their product is data, that can be a very impactful event and very costly event. I have seen customers jump ship because of lack of security as they perceive it. And I've also seen people resigning because they felt unsafe. They felt that the strategy wasn't right in their view. And the cost does go as far eventually as the cost of remediation. Now, in the example that I referred to there with the investment goods supplier, we did actually end up spending about 1.5 million over the next 24 months in improving cybersecurity. And that was money that wasn't budgeted for. The budget was substantially smaller, and it took us quite some time to even bring it down to that value. But the cost of remediation, improving the threat protection, having a better understanding, doing the education, having faster response times and better recovery options was very, very costly to this. So, of course, you'll ask yourself, what can companies do to protect themselves? And I think that's a question for Jen.
There we go. Yes. So for me, the art of protection against all kinds of cyber attack is in getting the basics right. So it's really tempting as kind of IT people to think about how we can layer different technologies to help prevent cyber attack. But actually, in reality, a lot of these are very kind of low tech attacks. So if you think about phishing attacks, that doesn't need a lot of technology to make it work. It relies on again, people's weaknesses. So I think to have a comprehensive set of protections, you need to think about all the people that are involved in the processes that run the business. So, and it's looking at really simple things like staff behaviours around passwords is a really key one. So there's a study that was done a number of years ago now that suggested that the vast majority of people only use 3 passwords when actually the vast majority of people have access to 38 different services at work. So if just imagine one of those passwords is compromised, actually that's almost the keys to the kingdom. It doesn't take a cyber criminal genius to work out that actually if one account's compromised, the likelihood is they're going to be using the same email address and the same password for all of those different services. So making sure that staff know about good password behavior. And then also we can support that as technologists by implementing things like 2-factor authentication. So actually if those passwords are compromised, then the impact of that can be lessened because we've got that extra layer of protection. It's also looking at things like access control. So if everybody in your organization has local admin rights to their devices, for example, then the impact of their devices being hacked or their passwords being compromised is significantly more than if that access is restricted. So it's really important that businesses have a good kind of a good access control policy and using what we call the principle of least privilege, so that staff only have access to the the minimum of services that they need to perform their role. And that's then supported by having robust processes around when somebody leaves the business or when somebody moves roles within an organisation. So I visit a lot of law firms to carry out security assessments, and I quite often see where people have acquired various permissions through moving job roles, and actually those set of permissions are now no longer necessary to do that role, but they've almost acquired them as they've moved through the organisation. It's then looking at other really basic things like, are we making sure that all of our devices are patched and up to date? So there's any organisations using Windows 7 or Server 2008, there are now 511 vulnerabilities on those operating systems that Microsoft no longer are going to patch and support. So making sure that these real basics are taken care of, for me, is always the first step. And then on top of that, you can add the kind of technical support. So add in a really good anti-malware solution so that anytime one of your staff downloads a file from an email or from a website, that actually it's going through that filtering process as well. We talked a lot about ransomware, and there are some really good anti-malware solutions for ransomware that can detect that before it hits your infrastructure. So it's about having those basics in place and then adding the technical solutions to support it. Whereas actually quite often we see IT departments implementing lots of technical solutions without actually thinking about the basics and understanding where the risks are first. It's about getting it the right way round.
And Jen, in terms of getting it the right way round, obviously a key part of that is planning for an attack. So we know that statistically, you're far more likely to be attacked than not attacked. It's a matter of if not when. In your role as a Cyber Essentials Plus assessor, how many firms do you sort of come across who don't have a sort of comprehensive cyber attack response plan? Maybe you could, I'm going to pop a link up to the exercise in a box bit on the Cyber Security Centre. I think that's a good thing to reference.
Sure. So I think in reality, the vast majority of firms that I've visited actually struggle with this area. So I know a lot of businesses do have continuity plans and they do have disaster recovery plans, but actually it's very rare that I see any firms test those with a cyber attack scenario. They tend to test them with a kind of power outage or a loss of service scenario, but very rarely in a cyber attack scenario. The link that Tom's put in there to the National Cybersecurity Centre's exercise in a box, this is designed as a tabletop exercise. A little bit, I'd describe it as almost like a murder mystery for a cybersecurity exercise. So you don't have to take any systems offline. You can do this as a tabletop exercise. And what they do is they give you a variety of scenarios that you can actually exercise amongst your team. And it's really important that this is done across the business, not just with the IT teams. I think that's where you'll get the most value from this. But it gives you scenarios, and then at various points as you work through the scenario, there'll be an interjection. So for example, okay, now you've just found this piece of code, or now the press have just asked you for a statement. So it actually does model kind of real scenarios, and it allows you to actually look at what would we do in the event of a cyber attack. And I think that's the part that's missing from the disaster recovery plans and the business continuity plans that I often see.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Jen. Some really useful insights there. David, can you tell us a little bit about your own past experience of cyber events when working within a law firm?
Sure. I've just done a reset, so hopefully just nod if you can still hear me, and then I'll carry on. Good. Okay. Yeah, excellent. I'll break it down into the sort of the constant sort of weekly, monthly threats that you were seeing, and then I'll talk about a biggie. But certainly, Fiona's being impersonated was something that was, almost every month that there may be an occurrence of that, where the cyber criminal has actually pretty much hacked into the client's I'm talking about a consumer law firm here, where we were dealing with many members of the public rather than business systems, and their email accounts would be hacked. They would see the emails coming in from the lawyer, and they would then put together a sort of smart impersonation asking for funds and other things at the right point in the transaction. At the point of moving our money, and suddenly the email comes in, we need you to pay the funds now, please, into XYZ account. And I'm sure everybody on this call listening in has now for some time added the email footers and headers and everything in your notes that say, we will never ever ask you to change the account we want you to pay the funds into, or we will never mid-transaction tell you about a change in that. But despite, and we had scripts where at the very beginning of an engagement with a client, we'll say, we're just telling you now, if you get this type of email, we'll never do that. Okay, that's not how we do business. But despite all of that, it still happens a lot, because I suppose when you're dealing with members of the public dealing with very important transactions like buying and selling a house, where all they're thinking about is the deadlines and the timings and doing things and not delaying, people can and do, unfortunately, still be caught unawares and make mistakes. And dealing with that impersonation is then very difficult, because first of all, the client comes to the law firm and says, you've sent me this email, which is not true. You have to go through a process of both proving it's not. The first thing is you have to prove it's not you. You do double check that your own systems haven't been penetrated in some way, and that you're okay. You're also then trying to track what's happened with that email, but also speed of response with the banks is very important, because if they've sent the transaction, then the first things you need to be doing is contacting the banks and trying to halt the transactions. And it really depends on whether the client has come to you and told you about it in a fast manner or a straightaway manner. So certainly in the last firm I worked for, one of our strategies was to get off email, and it was to design secure client portals fully integrated into our systems, so that all the main business of dealing with the conveyancing transaction was done in the portal with two-factor authentication and all sorts of other ways to guarantee a secure communication and transaction with the client, so you weren't relying on email. And that certainly had an impact, which was important. Targeted, I've already mentioned targeted threats to individuals. I think that's about actually spending some time reassuring teams through communications in the firm that if this happens to you, don't be silent, don't be shamed into thinking, if someone's making a very personal attack on you and saying that they have sensitive data and they're wanting you to reveal business information, most often than not, they don't have the sensitive information. They simply have your name and some details about a past username and password that they're trying to fib you into or delude you into thinking that you're at risk. So talking about it and escalating it and telling others that this is going on is very important. But people need to be encouraged to do that, especially when the attack can be can seem very, very, very serious. I talked about phishing attacks, so I'll talk about the biggie now, shall I? Which is that only 18 months into a law firm that I started at, we had quite a serious ransomware attack on the firm. We had an investment program to invest in BCP and DR and backup technology, but we'd only got as far as the backup technology. So, and thank God we had. Only 6 months before this particular incident I'll describe now, we'd improved our backup technology to back up not just data, but systems, which we didn't have sort of previously, but we hadn't quite got so far as to building a secondary or a third data center. So we were all in one primary data center, and a ransomware attack came in. It was through a phishing attack. And I remember it well because it was 7 minutes past 5 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon on the 18th of December, a day that will live in infamy. It etched on my mind and the mind of many, many others. And this ransomware ripped through about a third of the server estate in minutes. And unfortunately, the third of the estate it ripped through wasn't all the replicated Citrix servers and RDP servers, which is easy to restore, but the primary practice management, case management, document management systems, where all our core data was. And I remember getting the call from the IT manager. I was the CIO, and the IT manager called me and said, our servers are going offline. We've had reports of people not logging in. I'm looking at it. I'm getting ransomware messages. And that feeling, I remember being in my apartment at home and that sinking dread, and it was a feeling of absolute dread where you've almost got your head in your hands and you're like, oh no. There's that sort of pause where you think, what now? For me, it was to effectively immediately say, pull the plug on everything. And the reason it only hit a third and not the other 2/3 is that we quite literally, metaphorically and physically, got onto the data center and pulled the plug on the entire estate to stop the damage going any further. And that was the beginning of a 17 or 18-day period. Now, we got through it for a number of reasons. Firstly, it happened at Christmas or just before Christmas, and a lot of law firms have a Christmas shutdown, and so do we. And I think timing, there's never a good time for these things to happen, but certainly happening through Christmas is probably actually, other than ruining Christmas for me and a whole bunch of people, it was probably timing that saved us a little bit. We didn't have a failover data center to go to, so we had to rebuild what we had. And the IT team effectively worked 20-hour days or 17 days in a row bar Christmas Day to get the firm back up and running by the 4th of January, which we did. And so, of course, I say of course, but there was no ransom was paid. That was never going to happen. Our backup technology worked and we were able to restore everything, but we had to rebuild everything from scratch. And when you've got many 20 terabytes of data, that takes a while to restore and build, and systems restore in the order to do it. So some lessons from that I'll just share with people. All our plans were digital. So when it came to what do we do and what order do we do it, we couldn't access it because it was on our system. So big error number one, we had a BCP plan for IT. It was digitally done and not printed out. So we had nothing on paper, which, by the way, did include passwords, administrative passwords, and key elements to systems build. So that actually caused a delay at the beginning in knowing how to get into systems and how to restore them and in what order, because the digital copies were part of what was encrypted. So lesson number one, have a big safe somewhere with a nice big file in it with some primary information that is kept secure, or indeed now, it's 5-6 years on now, you probably use other cloud storage solutions for trying to securely store your digital footprint, which 5-6 years ago wasn't maybe as prevalent and as obvious as it is today. So that was a key lesson and a key difficulty at the beginning in managing the crisis. The rest of the difficulty was to do with who is in control and who does what and in what order during the rebuild, because it was a small IT team and we were focused on securing the systems, making sure they were cleaned up and rebuilt and restored. But at the same time, we had to ensure the business continuity as much as possible as the firm. So, we had Mimecast and other systems for continuity of email, or telephone systems continued. So there were elements that continued, but there wasn't enough IT people to really do a good job at that continuity failover and do the work we needed to do in the restoration at the first time. So the sort of division of labor, if we can call it that, during a crisis is very important, including the information to fee earners and the lawyers about their own continuity, even their own practical continuity beyond IT, things that they need to do with their time recording and other things to try and continue to trade and do business. Who controls that and that messaging was something that was also flushed out. So we effectively wrote our continuity plan through the crisis and our recovery plan through the crisis, rather than having it robust to sort of run through. So there was a huge amount of learnings for me. I'll before I sort of hand on, I'll just sort of business communications, who controls that, business BCP, both practical as well as IT, the recovery IT team doing the recovery work, and the command and control. I was very grateful to have the support of the senior partners at that firm who backed me up in the approaches we took, and we did recover everything through that Christmas period. But it was a a difficult sort of piece. So have the plan, test the plan, have different people do, almost sort of federate responsibility with people in different departments doing different things. Because when it's just relied on a small team, they can't possibly do it all. It's not which is more important. The business continuity is as important as the cyber recovery from the systems, but there's only so much of certain people to go around. So you need to have a team beyond IT who are very much involved in the plan of restoration during a crisis when you're doing those things. So that was that. Just a bit on the mindfulness or the well-being. After the 18 days, we get up and running on the 4th of January, and we trade again. It's great, but the team, your IT team, is knackered in more ways than one. Physically knackered and also mentally bashed, and you then have to go straight into business as usual. All the things you have for IT is normal. You're still tidying up loose ends of system configuration, which is in addition. And you're probably putting a pause on other projects and various bits and pieces that ordinarily perhaps you had planned that you have to push back because your IT team's not really in a fit place to deal with it. There are mental well-being issues, mental health issues that come from a crisis, especially if it's been a very difficult one, beyond just the fatigue of individuals. And I'll give a personal example, is that I spent a few months after this incident overreacting to alerts and messages, standard IT alerts in the business. I thought that everything was a basically virus attack, and I was prone to trying to shut things down very, very, very quickly, just because I was then overreacting. And actually, the WhatsApp alert noise on my phone was triggering a panic anxiety response in myself, because I associated the noise of a WhatsApp alert with what was going on at the time of the main incident, when we basically were using WhatsApp to control communications in the business and other things. And a little bit of therapy that I had actually pointed that out to me. The solution was actually to change the WhatsApp theme tune, which, the alert notice. It was as simple as that, actually, because it wasn't so much the alert as the sound, the noise of the alert that actually affected me. It took me a few months, and along with my team, to move out of that phase and to recover from that. So that's just another example of the impact that these things can have, not just on the business and your client reputation, but actually on your people who have to deal with it. I think I've said enough on that for now, but hopefully there's enough stuff in there to carry on our conversation, Tom.
No, David, thanks for being so sort of candid with your sharing your experiences there. And I think it's probably a reminder that you don't really understand the depths of this until you're in the middle of the fire. And hearing some of those stories there in the middle of the fire, I think there's a lot of really, really key takeaways there, especially like you say, the mental health of the team and the well-being, because don't forget, everything else that other partners in other departments might want is absolutely not happening during that phase. So no, I really appreciate you being so candid with some of your thoughts there. Stephen, from a compliance perspective, what does a firm need to make sure they've done around a cyber attack? So here, I think we're sort of going into the reporting angle quite a lot. Oh, you're on mute, Stephen. Just need to take yourself off.
In a moment, but I think it's worth staying with that theme. In fact, before David, Jen had already referred to that. It's the people component, creating the right level of awareness within the staff, amongst the staff, as to what cyber attacks actually look like, what good cyber protection looks like, what business continuity looks like, is a starting point. And that brings me to the reporting side, because of course the reporting cycle is a relatively short one. 72 hours isn't an awful lot of time. So from a staff perspective, you really want to make sure that staff recognize there is a very short timeline. In fact, you almost want to educate towards over-reporting to begin with, rather than under-reporting. You definitely don't want to have an atmosphere of cover-ups being favored. You want to reward people for reporting incidents. even minor incidents, and you can always refer to the fact that that shows that the awareness training is working, that the materials that are provided are obviously hitting the mark, and that this is a good thing because the company is making itself more resilient in that fashion. So the cultural side and the awareness is absolutely of huge importance, because it's also part of the preparation that David was talking about. Nothing prepares as well as actually experiencing some of these things. The second leg in this is having the right processes in place. So GDPR and DPA 2018 mandate specific processes that need to be followed, timelines that need to be followed. And of course, we all know from financial processes, from other governance and compliance processes, that there needs to be a corporate process that supports that. So there has to be a documented incident response process, as David pointed out, but also where, for instance, there are data protection breaches, where privacy has been breached, there needs to be a response process to that, and that needs to lead into the reporting to the Information Commissioner's Office. The handling of the data subject access requests needs to have a process around it that works well and meets the timelines, which are usually expected by clients to be much shorter than they can be in practice. Investigation obviously takes a moment, but clients get very quickly very impatient and start asking for compensation if they have the feeling that their access request isn't being handled as a priority. So these processes need to be documented. They need to be fully tested. People need to have the correct awareness of those as well. And there's nothing better in that regard, and that includes cyber attacks, than to have, firstly, a tabletop approach. So I highly recommend the exercise in the box as well. But it does actually remain a truth that a proper full exercise, a proper dry run, needs to be performed. Now, I've spoken to 4 clients about the cost of doing such a dry run, because that's material. We could be talking about literally hundreds of thousands of pounds for a large company to push through with such an exercise and take all the steps. But we've seen the figures. The NCSC has figures on the average cost of a cyber incident, and that's not in the 100,000s, that's in the millions. So I think we need to be aware that there is a cost to being prepared and to having these processes in place. The third leg is, in my view, having clear roles and responsibilities. It's the old compliance mantra of fostering a sense of ownership and also fostering leadership in those situations. It's absolutely perfectly okay to have champions of cybersecurity who pick up on the signals that things are going a little bit adrift, that there's a bit of complacency in the cybersecurity area or in the data protection area. It's good to have those people lead by example and to use positive reinforcement. But it really has to be part of the awareness approach for all staff that they own this topic. It's part of what they do. It's not something that another department does, or worst of all, this old sense that we had about 20 years ago. Well, cybersecurity is obviously something that the IT manager owns, and he's got full responsibility. We'll let them get on with that. So that thinking needs to really be inculcated in people, that they have an ownership. And then it's a matter, and that's the fourth leg, and this is what takes time, as David showed us in his example, is to build operational resilience, to have a plan for a fast return to operations, and to exercise that plan and bring it to bear, have it properly documented. Jen mentioned the importance of strong policies. These policies, of course, also need to be widely publicized inside the company. People need to sign up to them physically. I've seen very good examples, particularly in law firms, of a process whereby these policies are underwritten specifically, personally, by every single staff member. And in my view, that's the only way to do it safely. People will remember that exercise. It's a big part of induction. That's a very important step. And also remembering, and that's the last point there, that compliance always benefits better from positive reinforcement. Penalizing and naming and shaming are usually counterproductive. It's about celebrating progress, keeping the materials engaging so that that in actual fact staff have personal takeaway from these materials and say, well, I learned this today at work, but in actual fact it's true. My mobile phone is not properly protected. If that falls into the wrong hands, I'm immediately for it, because all my bank details, my access to my personal finances, all of my contacts are immediately available to anybody who steals my phone. So actually having that personal takeaway and doing something about our personal safety is usually a very good incentive to take part in these training and awareness exercises. So building operational resilience does rely very much on celebrating progress and having engaging materials and having this constant awareness drive in the company.
And Tom, I'm just going to complement that a little bit further if I can from what Stefan has just said, that post the events we had where we continued our rather accelerated investments and improvements from that point on. But the strategy, I wanted to keep it quite simple for, 3-word strategies. I always believe are things that can resonate and stick in people's brains. And so certainly the firm I was at, we had a stop, prevent and recover strategy from that point on, which involved technical solutions and people-driven process solutions as well. Stop the threat from coming in. So what are all the technologies and the training to actually prevent something coming in and doing harm? Then secondly, prevent, which is if it does get in, how do you prevent it from spreading and doing harm? How do you limit the impact of what that is? Which is also to do with technology and software solutions, but also people's ability to react quickly, and knowing that reacting quickly is actually very, very important. And the third and very important part is unfortunately, if it's come in and it has spread and done some harm, how do you recover? So what are the abilities to recover quickly and recover well? And so I found that certainly talking in those very simple terms of strategy within a law firm is that fee earners and support staff alike could understand those elements. And there was a huge amount of projects and underpinning tech and process and training and coaching underpinning those themes.
I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the positive reinforcement angle you spoke about, Stephen. I think the idea of departmental security champions is a really good way to, one of the questions we often get is, well, how do I engage people in training, especially people working at home now? How do we get them engaged? And I think encouraging them to take ownership is a key part of that. And the departmental security champions who maybe meet once a month, etc., as a group, and really encouraging that internal leadership and sort of that ask down, tell up culture. I think is a really valuable way of doing that, because that's certainly a question we get asked a lot when we talk to firms about training, is how do we get people engaged and sort of focused on the subject. Jen, sort of come to you for like our last question. So the SRA thematic review around cybersecurity was produced at the end of last autumn, and they talked about Cyber Essentials Plus, and basically said the firms they visited were the ones that had Cyber Essentials Plus were in a better position to defend themselves from attack. And we've talked about people, we've talked about processes, we've talked about the preparation. Where does Cyber Essentials Plus sort of fit within what we've talked about for a law firm?
Okay, so I think the best place to start with answering this question is the whole reason why the Cyber Essentials scheme exists. The National Cybersecurity Centre was set up with the intention of making Britain a safe place to do business, so to attract investment. And part of that process was recognising that actually large parts of our economy are made up by kind of small and medium businesses who maybe don't have the kind of millions and billions of pounds worth of budget to spend on huge kind of security teams. So the National Cybersecurity Centre came up with a list of kind of 5 main areas of focus that businesses of any size could work on, and actually that would reduce their risk of cyber attack by 80%. So this is coming back to what I said in a previous question about doing the basics right. So the Cyber Essentials scheme was set up to allow businesses to benchmark themselves against a set of 5 technical controls that are achievable for any organization. Where Cyber Essentials Plus comes in is it involves a technical audit by an assessor, an approved assessor, and it actually gives the firm that rubber stamp that not only are those controls in place, but actually that they're working and they're effective. So part of the technical audit is that we will actually send dummy virus files to your email accounts and get you to download them from the website so that we can see that actually your antivirus, not only is it in place, but actually it's turned on and all of the file types that should be kind of prompting warnings or blocking attachments are working. We also do an audit of your patch levels. So although you might think that your outsourced IT provider or your IT team are on top of their patching, and quite often we see that where there's actually a really robust process in place. But actually on a few occasions that hasn't been completed and there are vulnerabilities on the devices that are being tested. We also do a scan of the infrastructure from the outside, so almost a hacker's view. If somebody was trying to attack your organization, the first thing they would probably do is and part of their reconnaissance is they would do a scan of your infrastructure, and anybody's able to do that if they know your IP address. That's all they'd need. So we actually give that information as well as to any vulnerabilities that are actually exist that are plainly obvious to the outside world. So it just gives that extra bit of reassurance that not only are your controls in place for these basic areas, but they're also effective.
Cool, thanks, Jen. For those that want to learn more about Cyber Essentials Plus and what's involved in being accredited, I've popped up a poll. So if you'd like to learn more, just click on that. And I've also put a handout for you as well, which explains a little bit about sort of what Lawyer Checker do as a Cyber Essentials Plus assessor, which will give you a little bit more information on that. I think we're pretty much coming towards the end of the session now. So I've got one last question, which is a bit of a quick fire answer to sort of throw around the room, and then we'll move into answering a few of the questions. So firstly, ultimately, whose responsibility is it to ensure a firm is adequately prepared for a cyber attack? And I think this is a good one to focus on, because I know a lot of our attendees will be small to medium-sized businesses who maybe don't have the internal infrastructure, and especially with some of their outsourced infrastructure maybe being non-sector specific. Where should that responsibility lie? Quick fire answers. David, I'll put you under the microscope first.
If it's a limited company, it's the board of directors. If it's a partnership, it's the senior partnership of the firm. It has to be bought into from the very top, the responsibility for making sure that you're safe and secure. There may be people like a CIO who are responsible for supporting that strategy and implementing that strategy, but the responsibility doesn't just end at the IT director, the CIO. It has to be the senior persons within and stakeholders within the business.
Jen?
I completely agree. I think as part of anybody's kind of job description coming into an organization, there has to be a reference to their responsibility, information security. It has to run through the whole business. So it's, again, echo the sentiment that it's not an IT responsibility. It is a business-wide responsibility. At the end of the day, if you do suffer a cyber attack, it's not your IT manager who's going to stand up and tell your clients why you've been attacked.
Stephen, anything further to add?
Completely agree. Just to emphasize that the days must be over of pinning cybersecurity and data protection responsibilities to particular job roles. There's no space for that, and the law says so. It's the responsibility of the leadership team.
And good to see some of our attendees are agreeing in terms of it lying at board responsibility. I think it definitely, for me, has to sit on an agenda and a partners meeting or a board meeting monthly. It's got to be there. we have a couple of questions. First one was from Trevor Helliwell. In the aftermath of an attack, what is the easiest, best, quickest way to stop an infection spreading through your system? David, I'm going to come to you with that.
Pull the plug.
Literally.
Literally what we did. Pull the plug. There's the nervousness about doing that sometimes. I don't know why. The most serious harm that is going on is what is going on with the particular incident. So, pulling the plug at least stops it and then puts you in a position of control rather than just sitting back as a spectator and seeing the whole world.
No, I agree. It's a brave thing to do, but ultimately you got to do the right thing at those times, and sometimes that requires, in those tough times, you have to make brave decisions.
Yeah, and quickly, and doing it, because actually otherwise there's no point. I do agree that pulling the plug sort of only works in a limited window of time. If the damage is done, the damage is done.
So that brings us to the end of today's session. I'd like to thank all the audience for obviously logging in so promptly and staying online throughout the 50 minutes. I appreciate we've gone over a little bit, but hopefully there's been some really useful takeaways and insights into what we've talked about today. You can see all of the panel members have their email addresses on the slide. So you're more than welcome to ask any particular questions if you wanted to reach out to anybody from today's session. From a lawyer checker perspective, our next piece of content around cyber will come up in June, where we have a guest from the National Cybersecurity Centre who's going to be joining us. They've released quite a lot of new content over the last month or so, so I'm looking forward to hearing some more about that. But I'd like to thank the panel members for their time. Jen, Stephen, David, some really great takeaways and insights there. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks everybody for viewing. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.